Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Middle of October. Things are starting to, leaves are starting to change here, starting to get a little bit cooler. Fall is definitely upon us. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective. I am currently on the road, recording this one a little bit early, but on the road in Europe. Should be back fairly soon. But, a lot of days on the road lately. It's good to get out and see the rest of the world and see what's going on. You know, as we were recording the Cloud News of the Month this past couple of weeks ago with Brandon and Aaron, you know, we got into sort of a long discussion about OpenAI and the fact that they had now taken a big new round of funding. I think they took about $6.5 billion. And then there's lots of speculation that they're going to move from a quote unquote nonprofit, mostly nonprofit focused company into a for-profit focused company, which shouldn't surprise anybody if you're taking that much money. You know, in today's day and age, you're very, 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 very likely to be focused on a for-profit effort. So nobody's surprised by that. But it got me thinking, you know, we were really kind of talking about, you know, where the AI landscape was as of today. And, you know, in many cases, many conversations we have, it does often feel like the conversation is sort of centered around two companies, right? One is NVIDIA, you know, kind of dominating the infrastructure space of AI. And the second is OpenAI, sort of dominating the model space. And to a certain extent, you know, the application space, and we think about, you know, the applications that are probably making money and are most widely used, which are, you know, sort of general purpose chatbots, things like ChatGPT, which are starting to become multimodal, and things like application developer assistance, you know, so Copilot, GitHub Copilot, or things that are really powered by ChatGPT's models, but maybe are distributed through Microsoft or GitHub or others. And it, you know, it kind of got me thinking, you know, because as many of you know, if you listen to the show for a while, or at least this, you know, sort of weekend update episode of the show, I oftentimes try and do some historical significance or, you know, sort of historical look backs at how we got to where we are. And as we move into new things, is there anything that looks like a pattern that could be repeating? And as the guys were talking, as we were doing that show, it kind of got me thinking, you know, is the competitive nature, sort of the market dynamics that we're in right now, are they similar, or are they, you know, significantly different than we've seen in other big market shifting times, right? And so, you know, the things that jumped out to me were basically sort of I don't want to say the original birth of the internet, you know, not the 1960s going back to DARPA, but sort of the sort of original kind of explosion of the commercial internet as we know it, you know, web browsers and the use of things like Linux and open source, you know, the work that we see in cloud computing, mobile, some of those really big sort of shifting trends, you know, from the previous generation of computing and the previous generation of devices. And it kind of got me thinking, like, does the sort of current OpenAI, NVIDIA duopoly look like anything we've seen in the past, or does it look very different than things we've seen in the past? And I thought it might be interesting to kind of explore that today on the show. And so I think we're going to try and do that right after the break. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we are going to kind of take a look from a historical perspective, from a trends and patterns perspective, if what we're seeing right now in terms of some of the early evolution with AI, or at least this sort of generation of AI, has any sort of discernible patterns or things that are similar to any of the big shifts that we've seen in the past when you know, big technology changes came along, or if what we're seeing is really, really different. And the reason I'd like to do some of these things is it gives us some sense of, you know, if we see patterns emerging that are similar, then you can sort of look at maybe what the next logical steps were, or the next actionable steps that happened in that marketplace, or if they're very different, to try and figure out, okay, you know, why is it different? And you know, given the differences, what, you know, and given, you know, today's market and today's sort of environments and so forth, how much, you know, what could you try and predict out of, you know, what might happen? Mm-hmm. And so I made some lists of a few things that, you know, we've seen as big changes, and this goes back, you know, roughly 30 years now, as far as, you know, kind of our technology landscape. And granted, there have been, tons and tons of incremental changes from a technology perspective. But I grabbed, I don't know, 7 or 8 things that sort of jumped out at me. And my list was sort of the first sort of internet infrastructure, mainstream internet infrastructure, when the web browser and web server sort of came along, mainstream Linux adoption, or sort of, I should just say sort of mainstream open source adoption, the idea of moving away from proprietary software and hardware. Social media, when it came along as a new communication platform and information distribution mechanism, cloud computing, the smartphone, and then we kind of get ourselves to AI. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 6 big things that sort of came along prior to AI. And are there any patterns in terms of sort of the early leading companies versus sort of the companies that might have dominated throughout that versus what we have today, right? What's similar, what's different, whether it's, funding or who the founders were, the makeup of the founders, what the market competitors were. And I thought it would be sort of interesting to sort of explore each of those things and then put those into context for where we are today with our current sort of what seems like a duopoly in the AI space. So let me go ahead and take a look at some of these things. So, from an internet infrastructure perspective, and I sort of lay this out as sort of not the earliest, but early days of sort of building out the infrastructure of the internet. So in this case, a lot of it was sort of routers and switches, infrastructure that was moving or really building, if you will, the early internet, prior to it becoming the thing that we are dependent upon for sort of everything in our life, whether it's communications or entertainment or, how we do commerce or communicate with friends and family, all those sort of things. That early build out really came from Cisco. And if we look at that space, it was very new. It was kind of, we weren't really sure what it was going to be. Why do we need to have this system? We have other systems in place. We have the ability to send information along as like mail. We have the ability to make telephone calls. So we were able to communicate with people. Information was distributed, although it was typically distributed in books as opposed to digital format. So, this was sort of we have to kind of figure out why we need this thing. And then it sort of snowballed from, that's what this can do. And this changes the cost structure of things. And it breaks down kind of geographic barriers and so forth. But it was, kind of came from a smaller company. Cisco was, not a hugely funded company. In fact, most of their funding was never actually used. If you go back and read the history of Cisco, they were very profitable from an early day. Really didn't use a whole lot of the funding from folks like Don Valentine and Sequoia. But they were kind of the only one at the time that was really building this. There wasn't a whole lot of competition, at least in the earliest days. There were, over time, other companies came along, but, they had about a 4, 5, 6 year window where they were kind of the only ones doing it. And it really wasn't a matter of like, could they compete with other people? It was like, could they actually make the technology work? Because obviously there was, lots and lots of challenges of how do you, interconnect things over telephone wires and things that weren't designed for data networks and so forth. So Cisco was originally a very technically founded company. The original founders were, originally so technical that the VCs had a hard time taking them on the road because people had no idea what they were talking about. They were so technical. Eventually, they were sort of pushed out in favor of more of a sales-driven leader in John Chambers, but the guy before him, whose name I forget, and I feel terrible about that because I used to work at Cisco. It'll come to me at some point. So they sort of went from, very technical, small company, eventually sort of sales-driven, and, market fit happened relatively quickly, although, people figuring out what they could do with the internet probably took another almost a decade or so before people really started to grasp what the possibilities were of unlimited communication and unlimited connectivity. And we've obviously strived for more and more connectivity since then. So not really a duopoly, sort of a singleopoly, if you will, for a little while there, but an emerging market and something that people were sort of struggling with. In the web browser space, again, this came out of academia. The Mark Andreessen sort of creating things in academia eventually became Netscape. Netscape went from kind of a technically driven company to Jim Barksdale eventually coming in and taking over as CEO. I mean, he was sort of the original CEO, but again, very business focused person. So This was sort of the origin of, finding all of the world's information. I guess I probably should have included search on here as well. I'll do that. But what the sort of the first interface to the internet for mainstream people. And so this came out of kind of an unknown company. It didn't come out of Microsoft. It didn't come out of Sun. It didn't come out of Oracle or any of the really, didn't come out of Cisco, for example. It came from kind of a startup sort of company, somebody who wasn't bound by their current business, relatively technical founders, people who were kind of inventing the business model as well as inventing the technology. So sort of similar to Cisco in that sense. Didn't necessarily take a lot of funding, obviously some VC funding, but not a ton of funding. Eventually, they sort of got run out of the market because it became a commoditized thing and got picked up in things like Windows and other things. But, another sort of early company that got an early jump on things, but came from, sort of small company. The next one, I guess, would be on my list, mainstream Linux. Linux in and of itself, obviously, started as a response to people not being able to pay for expensive proprietary hardware, not being able to pay for expensive proprietary Linux as an operating system. So very much a community effort. So sort of, think of it as sort of the smallest, it wasn't even a company at the time. And then you saw companies like Red Hat sort of figure out a way to commercialize that. But again, very, very small company, startup company, didn't take a lot of funding, technical founder, but not really the technical, sort of face of the company. So the people who eventually, Bob Young and others, weren't super technical, right? They were less sort of technical, if you will. So I think, we're starting to see a little bit of pattern. Some of the early trends didn't necessarily come from an existing big company, right? It wasn't as if a big company said, hey, I want to expand where I'm at into something new. It was somebody new who was able to think about a market space very, very differently. Yes, technical founders, but the growth of the company didn't necessarily happen because of the technical founder. It really probably sort of happened more so because the more business-centric, sales-centric leader was able to kind of communicate to the world, hey, this is what this is what's possible, right? And got people excited about it. And once people start to see what's possible, they're able to think and sort of visualize what's possible. You start to see markets and ecosystems and other types of things, kind of expand. So, those are some of the earlier things. Then we started to get into, obviously search came along. We can skip search. Search is probably its own show. Social media comes along, and we start to see there was a bunch of things. There were some failed ones. Some of them just slipped my mind. Again, I'm remembering a lot of things from back then. But obviously we saw Twitter come along. We saw Facebook come along, and those were kind of came from out of nowhere. Didn't necessarily take huge rounds of funding, but really kind of sparked because of building upon what had happened with the internet being out there, with web browsers being out there, with Linux being out there, being able to build things at scale. Back then in data centers, but being able to do that at scale, and then really kind of taking advantage of people starting to realize, with all this connectivity, people want to be able to communicate in more real time, and they want to communicate with people beyond who they see day in and day out, at their grocery store and at school and those types of things. So, both of those, I would say, very technical founders, people who really weren't necessarily the greatest salespeople, right? Twitter had sort of a weird threesome of people, Biz, Stone, and the one other guy, Jack. And then Facebook obviously had Mark Zuckerberg, who was incredibly awkward early on. But they figured out business models around them. It took them a while. Facebook obviously figured out the ad business model much faster than Twitter ever did. But kind of, again, starting small companies, sort of starting this, relatively technical founders, but the more business facing, or the faster they figured out the business facing piece of it, the faster they sort of took out. So again, we're seeing that pattern sort of happen again and again. Now, when you get to the next on my list, cloud computing, this is sort of an interesting one. This is where the model starts to flip a little bit in terms of the originators of this. So I'm going to give Amazon credit for being sort of the originator of cloud computing. You probably could argue maybe it was Salesforce even before that, doing SaaS, but really reshaping the industry in terms of, we had gone multiple decades of companies building their own data centers, running their own environments, to Amazon basically saying, hey, you could sort of take that middleman out and we could run these things for you. So now, are they the first sort of hosting company? No, by no means, but they really kind of changed the paradigm of that. And to a certain extent, this is another one of those ones that kind of flips that previous paradigm of it always coming from smaller companies. Now, you could argue that it was unusual for cloud computing to come out of what was perceived to be a retail company. Amazon was perceived to be, now they're online retail, but a retail company, a company who, the world wouldn't have perceived them as being a technology company, a company that would have started cloud computing. And the founder there, Jeff Bezos, was very much perceived to be a business-centric person. Although, if you go back and sort of look at a lot of history, he was always somebody who was looking for technology to push a differentiation, to push the ability to change what they did. Obviously, they weren't a brick and mortar retailer; they were always an online retailer, at least until recently. And then, obviously, the sort of creators and founders of Amazon Web Services, depending on which story you believe, whether it was the guys out of South Africa, whether it was Werner Vogels, whether it was Andy Jassy, it was some combination of all of those. They sort of put forward a face of both, sort of a two-headed monster, if you will, between Werner and Andy. Andy sort of portraying less as a technical person, more as a business person, but obviously very technically savvy. Werner, as the CTO of the group, obviously came across as very, very technical. And they showcased, technology in many ways. Now, their thing was very much not inventing technology. Now, they invented a bunch of technology. Things like S3 are pretty revolutionary, and, how they do things with EC2 is very revolutionary. But it was much more a business model from day one. And so we're, kind of beginning to see a shift from, purely technology changing to really, leveraging technology to start to change business models. And Amazon being kind of a unique one of coming from a bigger company. I don't know, it's an interesting question. Could anybody else have funded Amazon Web Services? And maybe they could have, right? There's lots of arguments that, hey, an IBM or an HP or Oracle or Cisco or any of those folks had plenty of money to have done this. But this one is sort of unique in that they weren't trying to build it as a sort of an add-on or an adjunct to their current business. It was, how do we get in a totally different business, right? Somebody recognizing that we think there's a market inefficiency somewhere. We can go about doing that. So Amazon Web Services is sort of the first one to really, go into a space that wasn't necessarily adjacent to where they were, had enough funding from their parent company as opposed to like VC funding to go about doing that. So again, kind of shifting that paradigm. Now, as we get into smartphones, you could argue that sort of smartphones were in existence before. Folks like Nokia and BlackBerry or RIM, kind of had sort of smartphones, at least digital phones at the time. If you ever saw the launch of the iPhone, Steve Jobs made it very clear that what existed before really wasn't a smartphone. It was just, sort of a semi-smartphone. And so Apple's is very interesting. I went back and looked at the numbers. Apple was doing, a couple of 100,000 computers. I forget the number, like a million computers or so a year. And they were doing about 6 million iPods at the time the iPhone came out. And now they do about 95 million iPhones, I think a year, maybe a quarter. I'll have to look at the numbers. They're very, very big. It's about 10x what they were doing. So Apple kind of was an interesting, again, they sort of are starting to flip the paradigm a little bit of, you didn't necessarily need tons and tons of money to create a smartphone, right? It's obviously it's a complex device, but it's not massive. It's really more, once you start taking orders, you got to do manufacturing. But they were able to take advantage of, many, many decades of having built software on somewhat compact devices, right? From, a Mac to eventually the iPod. They were starting to learn a little bit at scale how to build more miniature types of devices, right? Which allowed them to start to have the expertise to build something that was an adjacency to their market. So they begin to also change this paradigm of, was the iPhone adjacent to, what they were doing? Maybe, right? They'd already been in the handheld device business. The phone was a very different device, but if you really think about it, it's called a phone, but for the most part, it's really a computer in your pocket. So it's an extension of what they did. I think where they became very, very successful was they didn't look at it as an extension of a Mac, which many, many existing companies tend to do. Is they tend to say, let me take my incumbent business and kind of build an extension to it. They really treated the iPhone as a very different business. They realized that, their go-to-market was going to be different. It was going to go through the phone carriers and so forth. So, I think that the change there versus what we see today with companies trying to do innovation is, yes, it was a funded company. Apple wasn't terribly, terribly successful, by no means where they are today. In 2006, when the iPhone was getting ready to launch into 2007. But they did have a basis of technology and they had a basis of expertise to build a somewhat adjacent business, but they treated it as a very, very different business, right? So again, it sort of follows the pattern of, Amazon didn't treat AWS as sort of an adjunct to the retail business. They treated it as a very, very different business. So we're starting to see this flip of, the breakthrough technology, the breakthrough transformation coming from somewhat of an established company such that they had the funding to be able to start the project. They found technology fit and business fit, product market fit quickly, but they did it in, a different business. They weren't trying to build an adjacency to it. And so that brings me now to sort of where we are with AI and where I kind of started this whole thought process. Again, I was thinking about it from Cloud News of the Week is we were looking at, where's OpenAI, where's NVIDIA as sort of independent companies, not sort of linked together in any way, other than I'm sure OpenAI uses a number of NVIDIA GPUs to be able to build their models. But I was thinking about it more in the context of, we still tend to think of like Apple and Meta and Microsoft and Google and others, right? The big incumbent as sort of, big AI, right? Because AI is such an expensive venture, because the investment needed is so big, the next big thing is going to have to come from them. And it got me thinking, like, are they really the most likely outcome of this? And if you looked at it purely from an investment perspective, like who has a lot of money, then you would probably say, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? Nobody else is going to be able to compete in the, billions of dollars it takes to sort of play in the AI space. But then I also got to thinking about it as like, but that's never necessarily been the always historical trend, right? As I've sort of tried to lay out here is, we have seen companies in the past, the biggest technology company at the time, again, whether it was, IBM in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, whether it was Oracle, whether it was Cisco, whether it was an HP or, even Microsoft in the 90s and so forth, they weren't necessarily the company that drove the next innovation. And a lot of times they tried to drive the next innovation, but they made the mistake of making it an adjacency to their current business and then applying all the same sort of thinking that got them successful in the previous business to the new business, right? And that's, one of the things that becomes problematic for companies is they assume, well, I've got to reuse my go-to-market. I've got to reuse my sales channel. I've got to reuse my same marketing. Sort of my brand is well known for doing something. So this is an extension of my brand. I don't want to start over. Brands are hard to do. Naming is hard to do. But when we look at the things that are really very different, or the changing things, the pattern has been you either start from scratch, i.e., a Cisco, a Netscape, a Red Hat, Facebook and Twitter, or you have to do it as sort of a separate, separate entity, right? Like you can't think the same way. And so it kind of got me thinking, yes, if we applied those same sort of that thought process, you would say, okay, OpenAI essentially, kind of came as a startup, right? They weren't necessarily part of something else. There wasn't something else going on there. Granted, they've been around for a little while, but they would sort of fit in the mold of something. They invented something brand new, and that's in the generative AI space and ChatGPT and the kind of way we think about LLMs today. NVIDIA obviously had been around for a very long time. They sort of fit more the mold of kind of like Cisco in that, they more or less sort of invented the GPU. I hope I got that right. There may be some people who tell me significant, historically I'm wrong about that, but they sort of are the GPU company, but they weren't the GPU AI company necessarily. They were like the GPU gaming company. And then OpenAI came along and they were in the right place at the right time. And they've obviously capitalized on, tons and tons of expertise, kind of in the same way that Apple took advantage of the fact that they knew how to build a software ecosystem around this space. And they obviously knew how to manufacture GPUs and so forth. But it does get me thinking, like, do we expect the other big companies in the space, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks and whatever, to go about doing that? And if we kind of explore what they're doing, Microsoft is kind of treating AI as an adjacency, right? So we look at, sort of co-piloting, them trying to brand Copilot along with everything, same go-to-market, same sort of seat-based licensing. So they're sort of an interesting, we expect them to do a lot because of, they were out early with OpenAI, but they don't necessarily own the technology. They're very dependent on somebody else. And they're trying to go about doing it in a sort of adjacent way. And, again, that's always been sort of Microsoft's model, is don't be sort of first to market, be sort of fast follower and then take advantage of what you do. So they're going to be an interesting thing to watch. Google is kind of doing the same thing, right? Like tons and tons of experience with the technology, somehow keeps missing the mark on branding or getting the world to understand that they built the technology. They were sort of first with the technology. But they are, again, very much taking we will embed it everywhere, as opposed to creating something new and standalone and a different route to market, right? Which, again, is, for Google is a little tricky because they just, in the past, whether they're putting out like Maps or Gmail or something, they just sort of put it out there, but they were independent of each other to a certain extent. And they probably would argue, well, on the back end, we're using a lot of the same tools and so forth. But, Maps wasn't dependent on Gmail, wasn't dependent on Android, wasn't dependent on another thing. And yes, they had linkages together, but on their own, they stood alone. And right now it feels like Google doesn't have a standalone thing that you think about as Google AI. They have sort of Google AI embedded in a bunch of other stuff. And so they're sort of, whether they're successful with the other stuff and this is just, kind of an extension of that, will be to be determined. And Amazon, again, is sort of following that same pattern of, you don't necessarily think of anything that Amazon does as being the Amazon AI. They're trying to just sort of make it adjacent to how they do AWS. So that's what Bedrock is. It's sort of, it's another service that comes from AWS. So it obviously it's hard to predict the future in AI. But I'm trying to figure out some sort of model in my head in which, is there anything from the past, the way that new technologies, the really breakthrough, industry changing, decade changing technologies that come along, and what does it look like right now? And to a certain extent, if we put aside all the craziness in the leadership at OpenAI, they very much look like a company who is entirely focused on the new thing. They are funded well enough, although their funding is very unusual, and the AI sort of funding to execution curve throws everything sort of off, or the ratio sort of throws everything off. But they look very much like the company who, could be the next Netscape and so on and so forth. Now, I don't know if that's a great thing to be the next Netscape, since Netscape didn't necessarily succeed, but they very much could be the next Facebook, right? In terms of, being the earliest adopter, having the most visible application. Now, you could argue, does ChatGPT have any sort of network effect, right? Facebook succeeded because of the network effect. As more people got on board, more people wanted to be part of the conversation, it grew faster and faster. Is there a network effect for ChatGPT? I don't know, right? It still very much feels like a individual helping exercise. It doesn't feel like, if my friends are using ChatGPT, that I'm missing out on something, right? It doesn't necessarily feel like, I'm not connected to ChatGPT. All right. And so I need to do something to get part of it. So those elements aren't necessarily there. It doesn't necessarily have a network effect to accelerate what it's doing. It feels like it has a sort of early mover techie fascination effect going on. But we'll see what happens there. Obviously, they just took this new round of funding. NVIDIA feels like the company who, is very much well-purposed to figure out how to be the picks and shovels for this latest gold rush. Now, the question for them obviously becomes, do they sort of follow the Cisco model of we need to keep expanding out and owning all the things around the infrastructure? So the security around the infrastructure, do they get into the cloud business, as I've talked about before? Do they sort of become the all things to everybody, right? Do they get into other chipsets and, buy up a Broadcom or, all, kind of get further into networking, further into storage, further into security? Or are they more than happy to just sort of say, hey, nobody else does GPUs right now, and as long as we continue to build the best GPUs, build the best sort of CUDA ecosystem, we will be fine. And so that'll be an interesting sort of thing. But they are somewhat dependent upon this Gen AI revolution really taking off. And so how much do they want to get involved with, building the next thing? Right now, they're just investing in the next thing. Obviously, they were investors in OpenAI and so forth. So it's going to be very interesting. It does feel like we're kind of right now at a stage where it feels like a little bit of blurring between, kind of the earliest transitional companies and how they were structured and their founders and market adoption, and the sort of second stage of it, the sort of Amazons and Apples who were, far, far smaller or far less relevant in the technology world than they are, today in terms of their dominance level. So it's hard to sort of say, okay, we've seen this pattern before. I think we're seeing bits and pieces of patterns, but we're not necessarily seeing the exact same thing. So it does make it much more difficult to figure out, okay, what do we do when we're seeing a half pattern here and a half pattern there? And then obviously, in the OpenAI space, it'll be very, very interesting to figure out, how much of their leadership, losing what feels like a bunch of technical talent, but who knows how many of those founders were still the driving forces in the company. But it does feel like the other part of the leadership, is Sam Altman, a Steve Jobs. He doesn't seem nearly as charismatic. I think we give him sort of pseudo charisma because he's the leader of this company that people are fascinated with ChatGPT. Does he have Steve Jobs charisma right now? No, not necessarily. He's a little, feels a little recluse and a little, trying to be, shadowy, if you will. But, maybe he will. Maybe he kind of grows into being that big personality that can sort of drive the sales side, the business side of things. Obviously, they're obviously going to move into being a business side company. So, it does feel a little bit like it's not clear. It feels like we're sort of in a hybrid environment of, what these new companies seem like and how they evolved and where they are. They're not sort of direct lines from what we've seen in the past. And that obviously makes it difficult to sort of predict the future. So anyways, would love your feedback. Show at thecloudcast.net if you have feedback or questions. Love to hear it. Where do you think the next sort of AI trend is going to go? Is it going to be this duopoly of OpenAI and NVIDIA? Are there other really big trends that you see in the AI space that make you say, oh, what those two companies are doing, will just be small change compared to, the next big thing that's coming along that needs to be talked about more and more. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap up. Hope you all are doing well. Hoping my travels go without any issues. I know next week is supposed to be a little bit chaotic around Europe. But anyways, hope you're all doing well. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. And we will be back next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.